So for my project, I interviewed this man, my grandpa, Rich Brooks. Now, my grandpa grew up in a very small mining town in California. He didn't experience much segregation until he was playing football up at Oregon State. A lot of segregation laws in California were similar to those of Portland, in which it decided where African Americans could live. Also, after researching the segregation laws in California for quite some time, it seemed that most of them had to do with the Asian or Mexican immigrants. My grandpa talks about Sam Bam Cunningham and how his USC team romped Alabama in a game which later made Alabama feel like they needed to start recruiting black athletes. That is somewhat true, but a couple years prior to the USC game, Alabama started to recruit black athletes, but didn't have any on their team until a couple years after the game against Sam Cunningham. Also, in a bonus story at the end, you hear about Fred Milton, who was part of a national civil rights issue that took place in 1969. That included the Black Student Union of Oregon State to call the students to boycott classes, and a walkout that is remembered as a very historic moment in Oregon State's history.
Well, I grew up in Allegheny, California, which is a town of about 120 people in Sierra Nevadas, and there were no minorities. And I went to high school in a high school where we had one minority, and he was the same class I was. He ran track, played basketball, and he was a student body vice president of our school in Grass Valley, Nevada Union High School.
Huh. So did, what?
Well, I didn't know a lot about prejudice or anything because, I wasn't around minorities, and the only one I was around was a great guy, and he was well-liked by everybody, and nobody had any ill feelings. He graduated in 1959 from high school, and he was our student body vice president.
So there was no segregation or anything, or like any experience with segregation?
Didn't know about it until I went to college, Gunnar. I didn't know about it.
Huh. So did you hear much about segregation growing up?
I didn't know. It started, most of where I became aware of it was in the early 60s after I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and early in my coaching career too, we played in a bowl game or a early season game in Auburn, Alabama, and one of the coaches, the black coach Gene Hilliard on our staff at Oregon State, we were assistants together, and we were in a restaurant. We went there 2 days early. We were in a restaurant, and they refused to serve him.
Wow.
And this is in early 70s. So that's how, I really started to get upset, and Gene reached over and just put his hand on me and said, "Just remember where you are."
Yeah.
So we all got up and left and went someplace else. But, and the kid that I played with in our senior year when we went to the Liberty Bowl in 1962, he was married to a white gal at Oregon State, and people really frowned on that at the bowl game. They didn't want him and her together.
Huh.
So this was my wake-up call to segregation, if you will, and prejudice. They were still really up until the early 70s. It was still very rampant, and I can equate a game to you. In fact, at the University of Kentucky, Kentucky had the first black player to ever play in the SEC, and that was 1967. So no black player had played football in the SEC until 1967. And at Oregon State, on the West Coast, that was it was never an issue, you know. I mean, black kids were playing at all the schools in those days.
Yeah.
And really, I think the thing changed when, from a football perspective, in the SEC in the South, when Alabama played USC. Bear Bryant was the coach at Alabama, and John McKay was the coach at USC, and they had a guy by the name of Sam Bam Cunningham, big fullback, and USC went to Alabama, and I think this was like 69 or 70. And Alabama was rated, I think, #1 in the nation, and SC beat him by about 4 touchdowns. And Sam Bam Cunningham scored about 3 or 4 touchdowns that game. They beat the heck out of them, and shortly thereafter, Alabama integrated on their football as well as the rest of the league in the SEC. So what happened on the West Coast took another 15 years to implement in the South as far as integrating sports teams. But I think football and sports had a lot to do with integration and the advancement of civil rights because of the people that played and did well in sports and the interaction on their teams. Well, it was a lot weirder 2 or 3 years ago when there were only about 5 or 6. I think that corner has been turned, and I think you'll see a lot more in the coming years. And I think it's because a lot more, black coaches are becoming coordinators as well at the college level. Well, I had 2 offensive coordinators here at Kentucky, and I was the first school in the SEC to have a minority offensive and defensive coordinator at the same time, Joker Phillips and Steve Brown. And that happened in 2007. I think, that's right, that would be the first time that I ever worked with a minority coordinator, period, as an assistant or a head coach. No.
Wait.
I take that back. I'm wrong. I hired, when I went to be the head coach of the St. Louis Rams in 1995, I hired Willie Shaw as my defensive coordinator. And he had been an assistant for me at Oregon State, and he had been a previous coordinator at the San Diego Chargers. No, he was an assistant there, but not a coordinator. So I gave him his first coordinator job, and that was in 1995 with the St. Louis Rams. Yeah, well, when I was coaching at Oregon State as an assistant, we had, under DeAndros, we had an incident with a linebacker by the name of Fred Milton, who just passed away last year. He was throwing a goatee, and the rule was that you couldn't have facial hair on the team. And it became not just a discipline issue, a major black-white issue. And the blacks basically were boycotting Oregon State. And this is back in like 1966, something like that. So we had black players on the team, but they were very upset, and Fred Milton ended up quitting the team because he was not allowed to wear facial hair.
Wow. Did any,
A racial issue, not a discipline issue.